covers the Flyers for 97.3 ESPN.com. You've heard him on the Flyers Minutes throughout the day on the station. It is our own Kevin Durso. Not just get the Flyers play tonight. You hear all the action right here on 97.3 ESPN. The coverage begins at 7 o'clock here. Also, you can listen on 97.3 ESPN mobile app. So if you can't get to the radio, you can pull up the app. You can listen to the Flyers right there on the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. And you got a bunch of reasons to download the app aside from just, the T-shirt Tuesday contest today. You can download the app, listen to the Flyers on there, get all the content from 97.3 ESPN.com loaded right to the app all day, every day. And some of that content is from our own Kevin Durso. So let's first start with the big news from yesterday about the coaching situation. I feel like the whole series of events was very fascinating. We saw that Dave Isaac at the Courier-Post made the report on Sunday night. And then the reports that the Flyers were denying that they were firing Hakstol. Then, according to reports and according to Chuck Fletcher yesterday, Hakstol basically went into their office this morning and was like, hey, I want a vote of confidence. And they said, well, we're not giving you it. And they let him go. I mean, talk about a strange series of events from a coach who has been here for 3+ years in basically 24 hours, going from being the coach to being out the door.
Yeah, it was very strange. It's really unlike anything we've ever seen before in terms of just a whole series of events, the reports coming out, Dave Hakstol wanting a vote of confidence because those reports are out there and not being able to get it. I thought it was very telling that Chuck Fletcher kept talking about the Calgary game, which was last Wednesday. They played 2 more games after the fact, and it sounded like that was really the turning point on him making some form of a decision. So I don't know how much merit there is to it leading into Monday morning and Dave Hakstol looking for that vote of confidence. I believe he did need a vote of confidence from the organization and couldn't get one, but I don't know how much there is to that being the deciding factor. But you could see the writing on the wall even as Sunday night approached. The team just looked lifeless over the weekend in Friday and Saturday's games, and that was probably an after effect of losing the way they did on Wednesday, but also the fact that you have the coach lose the locker room there, and when there's no communication and when there's no connection there between that team and the head coach, something's got to be done, and usually the head coach is the first guy to go when that happens.
Hockey seems to be the one sport, Kevin, that coaches get cycled in and out more than any other sport. Like, you don't see guys fired as regularly and as quickly in the other major sports as you do in hockey. Is it as simple as sometimes coaches don't connect with guys, or do you think sometimes the coach can be just a general scapegoat in a lot of situations?
I do think many times the coach is the scapegoat for any sort of problems that go on. And, the thing about the Flyers, too, and their franchise history in general is that it was starting to become kind of hard to believe that Dave Hakstol was around for as long as he was. He had coached the 3rd most games in franchise history without really any postseason success whatsoever. They made the playoffs twice in his first 3 seasons, but they didn't win a series. So for him to be approaching the 2nd most games and coached in franchise history and not have that success with the way that coaches are turned in and out and cycled the way that they are in hockey, it was a little bit surprising that he was still hanging around. At the same time, usually I do think it comes down to the voice of it a little bit, and I think that one of the things that comes down to coaching is when you watch players have more of a tendency to last longer in an organization, and systems come and go and change. And when a team starts going in the wrong direction, usually the first person they look to is the coach, because that's the system they're looking for, that guy to be the leader, to turn things around and to instruct in a way, to instruct and make adjustments. And I think one of Dave Hakstol's biggest problems in his time in the NHL so far, whether he's got more of a future or not, and so far and in his time with the Flyers, of course, was that I think he struggled to make those adjustments in game. He would have a game plan going into a game, but then as things change, as the score adjusts, as the game situations change, things would change. He wouldn't make any changes of his own. And I think you got that message from Chuck Fletcher, where he talked about puck management and game management and understanding the situations and all the turnovers that happened. So I think that all those things played a factor into this decision.
Hakstol was the first Flyers coach with multiple 40-plus win seasons behind that bench since Peter Laviolette, and that was 6 years ago. So it's not like he was this horrible coach, but I'm getting the sense from you and hearing other people talk about it, and then the reports we heard about what Ron Hextall was like behind the scenes. It seems like Hakstol was as stubborn sometimes as his boss Hextall was, and you gotta have to wonder. And you tell me, Kevin, how you feel about this. I feel like some of the moves that were made by Hextall were also reflective of the fact that his coach was as stubborn as he was as a GM.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the full case. I will say this: I think that the reason that Dave Hakstol was given as much time as he was is because of how stubborn Ron Hextall was towards the whole thing. That was Ron Hextall's guy, so it kind of isn't a shock to see everything start to crumble below what Ron Hextall had tried to build up in the 2 weeks since the new GM has been hired. Now the head coach that he brought in to be that guy is gone. So there's definitely some merit to it. I do think Dave Hakstol had some stubbornness to him about his lineups, about playing certain players, certainly about playing certain goaltenders. He rode the hot hand particularly anytime he had the chance to, and it led to injuries for guys like Brian Elliott and most recently Anthony Stolarz. So I do think that he had a little bit of a stubborn quality. I don't know how much of it was his own or if it was a product of working under Ron Hextall, but I do think there was some of that quality for sure.
Kevin Durso joining us on Volvo Kind of Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Check out all of his coverage of the Flyers over at 97.3 ESPN.com and also on the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Kevin, Flyers' new head coach, Scott Gordon. What can you tell the audience about Gordon?
Well, Scott Gordon comes from the Lehigh Valley Phantoms, the Flyers' AHL affiliate, and he's been there for the last 3 seasons, and he really took that team from being a team that didn't make the playoffs, that struggled to build depth. That was obviously a product of the prospects that the team had in the organization 4 years ago to what they have now. But he took those players and got them to work together and buy into his system and his style of play and the way he wants to see his team play, and got them to an Eastern Conference final last season. So he's had success at the AHL level. He's definitely gotten young players to buy into him. And I think one thing that's a big positive for Scott Gordon is that he has familiarity with a number of players in the organization. You look at guys like Travis Sanheim and Oscar Lindblom in particular as two who he's coached for possibly multiple years as you go through. Lindblom was with the team all of last season in the AHL, and Sanheim played 2 full seasons there. Robert Haig is another who played for a long time with him. So he's got connections to some of those guys that many people don't get to see because of the fact that was during the developmental stages of these young prospects. So I think that's a big positive for him. One of the things I've always found about Scott Gordon is that, at least with the Phantoms, he's gotten that team to come to the rink and play every game and be competitive. And the AHL is a little bit of a different animal. It's a little bit more scattered. Sometimes you get gameplay where there's a lot of wide open play at the AHL that you don't normally see at the NHL. But he's been in the NHL before too as a head coach with the New York Islanders about a decade ago, and that experience will help him here as well. It's not like let's make it clear that this is not necessarily the full-time decision. It's on an interim basis. That interim basis could last a couple months. It could last the rest of the season. He's certainly auditioning for his shot to take this job full-time, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, right now he's got the task of just trying to do the job that's in front of him, which is to try to make this team somewhat competitive this season if possible, and whatever happens for him as a result of that.
You mentioned the audition, and Chuck Fletcher mentioned in the press conference that, in some ways Gordon is getting a jump start on the audition. Like, this guy has 51 games to basically show the Flyers if he's the guy or not. What do you think would be a mark or something this season that would show Chuck Fletcher and the upper management of the Flyers that Gordon is or is not the man for the job? Like, is there a certain thing or accomplishment or lack of achievement that you think that they look down and they say that's the defining thing?
Well, I think the thing that's on the surface that most people are going to want to see in order to determine that is how successful the team is. Winning games is what's going to make a fan base confident in his abilities. From the management perspective, I think what Chuck Fletcher would want to see is somebody who comes in and gets this team to remain competitive, to cut down the mistakes. I don't think the wins and losses are going to matter to Chuck Fletcher as much as it will to anybody else outside of the organization, because I think what Chuck Fletcher wants to see is a team that plays with more consistency, that is more competitive in games. They can't go on stretches like they just did for 4 games and lose a pair of games by 3 goals, or they lost 3 out of the last 4 games by 3 goals or more. You can't see stretches like that where it looks like the team has no sense of the game situation and any sense of urgency or trying to avoid that kind of result. You do need to see games where the team is competitive, and maybe if they lose a few 1-goal games or lose in overtime in a highly competitive, low-scoring game, then you're seeing a step in the right direction. So I think it's going to be an evaluation based off of how consistent and competitive the team is, regardless of the record. I think it's just a matter of how competitive they are, because if it keeps going the way that it is, then it's not going to be favorable for Scott Gordon to maintain the job beyond whatever point Chuck Fletcher decides he wants to look to bring in somebody on a full-time basis.
Kevin, the other guy who's making his debut tonight is the well-talked-about and much, hyped-up goalie, Carter Hart. The guy's very young, but he's going to get his first NHL start tonight against a Red Wings team that this isn't your father's Red Wings, right? I mean, this is a Red Wings team that struggled a lot this year, so this may be a perfect opportunity to put a young goalie out there. What do you think Carter Hart has to do in the short term? Because it looks like he's going to get a couple weeks here to really show if he belongs or not, to say, hey, look, I belong up here, or maybe I need more time in the minors.
Yeah, I mean, the consensus is that this is possibly a premature move, and Carter Hart could have used the full season to develop, but the Flyers aren't in that situation where they have the luxury to do that. They know what they have in Michael Neuvert and Alex Lyon. Alex Lyon was sent down yesterday in favor of Carter Hart, so that clearly shows where Hart ranks in that regard. But mainly, when you look at Carter Hart, as a 20-year-old kid, I've had the opportunity and the ability to talk to him at training camp when he was still with the team in camp, and I don't know that there's a more confident 20-year-old out there who thinks that he's got the ability to do this all now and handle the situation. Obviously, there's concerns about the team that's in front of him and the way they've played to support a goaltender, but Carter Hart's the guy who's going to be here. They didn't bring him up to have him sit on the bench and collect dust. He's here to play, and with the roster freeze happening on Wednesday night at midnight and allowing the rosters to kind of hold until following the holidays, that's going to allow Carter Hart to get probably at least 2 to 3 starts this week alone, and then even in the following portion of the holidays, teams on a road trip for 4 more games before they finally come home. So he'll get probably a couple of starts out of that as well. So you can pretty much bank on anywhere between 4 or 5 starts, I would say, for Carter Hart at this point, because I think they're going to try to see what they've got. This is, as much as we just talked about auditions for Scott Gordon as the interim head coach, this is an audition for Carter Hart to see where he is, to see if he's ready for this opportunity. And if anybody's going to have the mentality and the confidence to take the opportunity and possibly run with it, it's going to be Carter Hart. So it'll be interesting to see. There's certainly a lot of excitement that he's here. It may seem early in the eyes of a lot of people, but if anybody's going to prove him wrong, it's going to be this kid Carter Hart for sure.
Yeah, you look historically, and I'm not trying to put him on this level yet because we haven't seen him at the NHL level, but you look at the history. The Flyers haven't had a great franchise goaltender since Ron Hextall was in between the pipes, and you look historically at other franchises and their big time goalies. A Martin Brodeur is in the NHL at 20 years old. A Patrick Waugh is with the Canadiens at 20 years old, and they both had different results. Waugh struggled at times. Brodeur is Brodeur from day one. Meanwhile, you look at a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury. When he first came to the NHL, he was inconsistent as well early on. And then you look at a guy like Dominik Hasek. That guy didn't come up till he was 26. So there's really no specific age or moment that is, I think, right for a goaltender, especially the goaltenders who go on to win the Stanley Cup, the guys who go on to win, in the big time for a team. So I think in some ways, and tell me if you agree with this, Kevin, I think in some ways, we're going to learn about who Carter Hart is, not just in performance, but, what his mindset is as a goalie, because sometimes you got to sink before you can swim.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say this for him, too, that I think the biggest concern that people have with the timing of this is that you wonder, he's starting to build that confidence in the AHL. He's had 5 really strong games in a row, got his first shutout in the AHL as a pro. So he's building that confidence there, and what people are afraid of is that you wonder if he plays behind this team in its current state, the way they've lost some of these games on the road trip, the numbers are going to look inflated possibly. And what would that do for his mentality and for his confidence? You certainly don't want to shake the kid at 20 years old. At the same time, there's really no way to tell where he is unless you do give him a shot to play. He's here to play. And I'll say this about him as well. I don't think that there's any issues with Carter Hart's fundamentals. I think positionally he's as sound as they come. He's definitely good at tracking the puck. He knows how to do a lot of the things that are fundamental to his position. If anything, much like the first few games that he had in the AHL, it's about the adjustment to the lifestyle and to the way that the schedule works and to the way that you prepare for a game and the players that you're going to be facing as well. That's all the adjustment process, and that's a mentality and a confidence that sometimes needs to be built. So we'll see how it goes. I think that from a fundamental standpoint, though, he's got all the tools to make this work. It's just a matter of how confident he is going in, and he certainly seemed confident that he was the guy that could get it done at the start of the season. Obviously, the Flyers had different ideas, and that was certainly on an older regime at this point. That's Dave Hakstol and Ron Hextall being in charge. So you're getting a new look at the new era of the Flyers here, and Carter Hart's certainly part of it. And you just hope that it works out in favor of the Flyers because they're resting a lot of hopes on this kid.
Kevin Durso joining us, the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Josh Hennig filling in for Rich Quinones on a Tuesday. 1:17 is the time. Kevin, you mentioned the team in front of Carter Hart. Chuck Fletcher, and I saw the whole press conference. I got the sense from him that the people in the front office, himself and the guys in the Flyers front, they believe that this team has been playing below its capability. That it seems like the Flyers front office believes that this team, as constructed, it should be able to win more games than they've been winning. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think that when you look at this team on paper, that's what we should be seeing exactly what they're seeing, that this is a more talented team on paper than what gives off the results. But at the same time, results don't happen on paper, they happen on the ice. And if I've seen anything recently, I think that what I can say about this team in this current state is that this is the last chance for them to prove that they can win and be competitive in the roster's current state. At this point, the GM is out, the head coach is out, you've got a replacement in a GM, you have an interim head coach, and you're going to find out a whole lot about this team from the playing roster in the next couple of weeks. The roster freeze is going to happen. I don't see the Flyers doing anything drastic over the course of the next 36 hours before that roster freeze happens. They've got a game tonight against Detroit. They'll go out and they'll play that game, and then they'll start preparing for Nashville on Thursday, and everything will be status quo with the playing roster up until past the holidays. But when you get past that point, again, they're going to be on a road trip that closes out 2018. They'll come home early 2019. At that point, maybe you have another one of those 2-week evaluation periods where now you have all eyes on the players because you evaluated the management, you evaluated the head coach, and all that's left is to look at the players. So I think that that's where that comes into play, where we'll learn how competitive this team should be and if they're playing up to expectations by watching these next few games and seeing if they're more motivated to play for Scott Gordon, more motivated to keep their own jobs in this case and keep their roster spots, and that's where these decisions will come from. But based on what we've seen in the last few games, it's a roster that does need changes, but they hold the keys to that.
Who's the guy on the Flyers right now that you feel like is the guy that has to be the difference maker moving forward? We've seen an inconsistency from Giroux. I know that Gostisbehere is playing below a lot of people's expectations. Some people are saying that Provorov is having a slump right now. Who's the guy on the team right now, or guys on the team that you say, look, if those guys can get this thing turned around, this team as a whole can get turned around?
It's really hard to pinpoint one particular player. You mentioned Shane Gostisbehere and Ivan Provorov. I felt that playing them together on a defensive pairing was only hurting the team because they were both struggling at the same time. So splitting them up may make a difference. Maybe it helps Ivan Provorov get his game back on track. Maybe it gets Shane Gostisbehere's game back on track. You never know. From the forward standpoint, Travis Konechny's gone a little quiet lately. Nolan Patrick's been especially quiet for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So he needs to have a big turnaround as well. There's a lot of guys that need to turn it around collectively. It's really, you mentioned Giroux's inconsistencies, and that's not true, or that's not incorrect, I should say, but it's also he's probably the most consistent player they have too, which kind of gives you an idea on the struggles that this team has had from a playing standpoint, where if Claude Giroux's had some of his inconsistencies of his own, but he's their most consistent player among forwards for sure, then that's a little bit of a concern. You've watched a lot of players kind of drop off in the last few weeks here, and I think that's a product of the changes going on, but at some point in time you also have to toughen up the situation here and take the situation for what it is. You got to play for your own job, or more changes are going to be made, and I think the players know that.
You mentioned changes. Real quick before I let you go, Kevin, I appreciate your time here on a Tuesday. You know, what in Chuck Fletcher's history tells us that if this team is in contention, he's going to go out and make the move? Does he have a history as a GM and as an executive that if he sees that this team needs a piece, or that they're right there on the edge, or he does need to make a little bit of a shakeup in the lineup or on the roster, that he has the history of not just willing to pull the trigger, but pull the right trigger?
Yeah, he definitely has a history of making different roster decisions and making transactions to help the team get better. I think what we have to kind of consider with Chuck Fletcher is the same situation he was in 9 years ago when he was with Minnesota. And at the start of his time as GM with Minnesota, he had to build the team out into that contender before he could make roster decisions and make trades or sign players that really was with the point of putting the team over the top. So you might see in the early going, you might see roster decisions that look not necessarily like selling moves, but look like even moves, moves that maybe give up a player or somebody who you would think is valuable enough that keeps this team going, but gets a player of value back. It might start slow like that to get to a point where you're making way for the prospects that you think are going to make the roster. One of the things that I've heard about Scott Gordon taking over as the head coach and being a guy who's worked with some of these younger players is that one thing that Chuck Fletcher will learn is that you'll get a real good sense of which young players are going to be worth building around and which ones are maybe just had their hot flashes and their stretches of success and are going to be guys who are expendable. So you might find guys like that as well. You never know. There's nobody who's completely safe in this situation. There's guys who are certainly more likely to hang around for the long term than others, but no one's completely safe, and that's what this evaluation point is going to be for. It's going to be a chance to see everything from top to bottom and to see if there's anything that they can do. I find it hard to believe that Chuck Fletcher is going to be able to watch this team over the course of the next 4 to 6 weeks and come away with it going into, say, February, knowing that he can do one thing or two things to put them into a position of contention. There's simply too much to do for him to be able to make that one decision. So I think you're going to see him start to consider all the options that allow him to build this thing out and to really go for it next year. I know that's not an answer that people love to hear, that people are tired of the wait until next year kind of thing, but I think people will also accept that it's a lot better of an answer than Ron Hextall's, well, in 2 to 3 years, we want to be poised to be making that run as well. So he is thinking long term. He's learned from some mistakes in his past, but he's also not afraid to go out there and do something if he thinks it's going to make this team better for the rest of this season and the seasons beyond it as well.
Give him a follow on Twitter at Kevin_Durso. Check out his work at 973ESPN.com. And, of course, the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Kevin, appreciate you taking the time here for an extended segment on a Tuesday. Because I think that, a lot of people I've been running into, Flyers this time of year is kind of like a hit or miss topic. But, when you have Carter Hart debuting and a new head coach all on the same night, people have a lot of questions, and I appreciate you taking the time to answer as many as you could.
Yeah, my pleasure, Josh. Thanks for having me on.